Did you know that there's a guy who wrote most of the books in the Bible? It's true. A lot of people think that the Bible was written by a lot of different people, but it was mainly written by one dude, and guess what? That dude was never a pastor, never went to seminary, never even had any formal training. It was a historian. Okay, so here's how it went down. There were these books that were considered holy, like the Torah and the Psalms and stuff. They were passed down for generations, but they weren't really organized. So this guy, Moses, he sets out to do something crazy. He wants to lead his people out of slavery in Egypt and into freedom. But before he does that, God shows up and gives him the 10 Commandments. Now, these commandments, they're pretty messed up. It's like you shall not murder, steal, lie, cheat on your wife, and don't put any other gods before me. And most of the people, they're like, yeah, we can do that. But after Moses goes up the mountain and hangs out with God for 40 days, they're like, yeah, we actually can't do any of those things. So Moses is like, awesome. He writes all of this down in a book. After he finishes that book, he writes down some more books, but he doesn't do it alone. He has help from some other dudes like Joshua and Samuel and Isaiah. And together they write down stories about creation and the flood and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and stuff. They also write down laws and poetry and songs and stuff. And over time, these books, they get passed down, and eventually they become the Old Testament. Then, like 400 years later, Jesus shows up and he's like, hey, I'm here to tell you that the kingdom of God is at hand. And he starts doing all these miracles and turning water into wine and healing the sick and raising people from the dead and stuff. And then he gets killed. But not for long, because 3 days later he comes back to life and then he ascends into heaven. After that, this guy named Luke, who's a doctor, decides to write down everything that Jesus taught and did. He writes down stories about creation and about Adam and Eve and stuff. He also writes down parables like the Good Samaritan and the Prodigal Son. And then he writes down the teachings of Jesus and stuff like the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes and the Great Commission and stuff. And then he finishes that book and passes it on to Theophilus, who's like a buddy of his. That book becomes the New Testament. So there you have it, the whole story of the Bible in like 2 minutes. And if you want to hear more Bible stories, just subscribe and we'll send you the rest of them.